So I basically just took some of the questions that y'all gave me and like tried to create some type of presentation for it. Y'all know how it is. So being that this is like a seminar, it can be very discussion based. Just know it's about like 17 slides. So I want to make sure. We get through them. I will probably send these out, but I have a big foreword in the beginning that says this is anecdotal. This is like based on research I have done. This is not going to be the same for all programs. Y'all already know that, but I just want to make sure it's super clear. So again, keep in mind, this is not the same for everybody, for every place, for every program, for every even like degree. Okay, so I kind of split this up into sections. So we're going to talk about like how to start and like how to choose what you're even interested in terms of like program, place, like advisor, all of those things. And then we'll go into application materials because y'all had a lot of questions about like, what makes my application stand out from somebody else's, which I think is a really important question to ask. Contacting professors was something that came up, funding, timeline, career options that can come from like after you graduate, and then other questions that just kind of maybe didn't fall into a certain category. So where to begin? So some of the ways at least that I have read about, like especially when I was in the process of applying for programs, was like there are different categories that you kind of need to consider when you're thinking about programs. And I think we've talked about this before a little bit, and some of this might be a review because I know we hit on some of these questions last semester. So starting with program, also ignore like the Latin little part that I did not change, the lorem ipsum. We're just going to ignore that. But for program, some of the things you want to think about are funding. Sometimes funding might be dependent on program. Sometimes funding might be dependent on advisor. So I know, Wendy, you asked the question about funding in general. So we'll touch on it a little bit in different categories. So program funding usually, like for example, and I'll just use Georgia State and some other programs I know like slightly well as examples of these things as we're working through them. Georgia State has like a minimum stipend amount, right? So like the minimum that anybody can get, I think within like 5 years of being within the program is $12,000 a year. So that's their stipend amount. However, like you're gonna make that, but you can also have external funding, which we'll get into. So looking at like program minimum funding could be something that's important, depending on if you're living in like LA, you're not going to be able to probably afford that. So that's going to mean like a bunch of loans for you. And if you don't have other funding, so that's something that you might want to consider. Also the focus. So I think also, Wendy, this might've been your question too, in terms of how to know where a program's focus is and how you can kind of like, I guess, narrow out and sort out your own focus as well. So who has gotten the clinical, because that will like make this a little clear, who has gotten the clinical or the counseling clinical grad book, like guide to applying for schools that I told y'all about? Anybody gotten that? It's okay if it's not a requirement, just a question. No? Okay. So that book, I don't think I have it.
I didn't have it with me, but last semester I was able to get it from the library. And so
Yeah, so I
there
can,
was like a score
right,
there.
I can try to find what's it called, online version too, because I know it has to be out there, and I have some websites for that, so I can look into that. But that book does a really good job, at least, of kind of explaining where people fall on that spectrum of clinical / research balance. One thing that you could do if you don't have that book, because I don't know if you all remember me saying that book is I think technically 2 years behind whatever's happening at the university now, based on the way they collect data and the time that it takes to update everything in the book. So if you want something that's more up to date, you can always ask like students and faculty members, and we can get a little bit into that with faculty questions or questions in general for folks at the program when you're doing interviews. So also the type of program is important. So PsyD, PhD, EdD, I think we're all looking for PhD programs, if I'm not mistaken, but each of these has their pros and cons, especially depending on the type of program that you want to go into. So if it's a program that is, for example, like Georgia State's counseling psych program, scientist practitioner, that means that like allegedly their values are within both scientist and practitioner. So you have like the clinical and you have the research. However, there are programs that have like different ways of splitting that up. There are some programs, and I think we've also talked about this in terms of it's like advocacy practitioner model or like advocacy researcher model, things like that. So that's important too, to think about what your values are. You can get like that advocacy piece if you want to be in like or counseling psych, but you know, it's important to think about that too when you think about the type of research and the type of program you see yourself at, because usually they're not going to lie, you know, and say like, oh, we're about this when they're actually not. So pay attention to the way they identify themselves as a program within research. Advisor. So like I said, funding, like you usually should have a minimum if you're going to be at a program. However, your advisor, for example, might have like a grant that they're working on and they can put you on that grant. So then you could have a chance to get, so for example, I was getting, like I was on the regular stipend at Georgia State and then Donnie got a grant. So then now I'm on Donnie's grant. And that can be for like however long the grant is, right? So I'm going to be on Donnie's grant for 2 years. So like that's something that could be really helpful. One, because it builds your CV to show that you were working on a grant and that you have this research experience and like you're connected to funded literature or soon to be funded literature. So that's something that's really good in terms of like building your CV and also your experience in the research field in general. But so just know that your advisor can be another source. Another example, Georgia State has like a Dean's Fellowship program where your advisor can vouch for you and apply for you, or like kind of write letters of rec and like say that you would be a good fit for this fellowship. So that's another way your advisor can get you funding. And always have conversations with your advisor if you're really interested in funding especially, and also go out and look for funding on your own. But usually your advisor will know some, hopefully not as competitive and hopefully to your research interest, because there should be some type of overlap there because it's your advisor. Hopefully they know, like for example, Minority Fellowship Program, you need to have a 2-year commitment to working with folks in marginalized racial ethnic groups, I believe. So that is something that like I would be okay with, but maybe somebody who didn't have that experience wouldn't want to commit to that. So your advisor will be a good place for fellowships that might be a better fit. Advising style is really important. Is your advisor somebody who is like super feminist and like that, like really just like a collaborator and a like a peer type of relationship, or is your advisor actually someone who more just kind of tells you what to do and you need to do it? So not saying that either one is bad, you know, people work in different ways, but it is something to think about yourself when you're trying to like make those decisions, because that is going to be the person that you're working with ostensibly for like the entire duration of your like rest of your educational career, at least as a student. So that's something really to think about. Another thing I will say, that kind of depends on the program. So if you're like in counselor ed, you might not be applying based on advisor, you might be applying based on program, and then you get matched to an advisor. So all the different programs are different, but who your advisor is can, especially depending on the program, if it's like you apply for the advisor first and then kind of the program after, that can be important. Research interests should overlap, and you should be able to like show the places that you overlap. You should be able to know your advisor's research, what your advisor is interested in, and how you can see yourself kind of shaping in and fitting into their own things. Also lab affiliation. So does your advisor have a lab? If they have a lab, what do they do? Does that lab have funding? Who is in that lab? Is it master's students, undergrad students? And what kind of like, what role does that lab play? Is it like a research lab? Is it like outreach? Is it fitting the things that you want? Location. So I'm sure y'all probably, I hope, I don't know, maybe we're all still coming to that, like in terms of where you want to be and what type of living environment works best for you. But climate can be really important. Same with like culture and weather, at least for me it was. So like depending also if you hold marginalized identities, which we all do in some way, you know, you want to make sure that you're safe. So you want to make sure that you have like a place, like a city, an advisor, a program that's going to affirm who you are, remember that this interview process is an interview both ways. So I know like we all may feel desperate to get within a program, but that desperation will trickle down to dryness when you're there for like your fourth year and it's like, wow, I really don't know why, you know? So really just like honor yourself and your values when you're thinking about where you would like to be. And then also the cost of living. So that's something that could be really important. Like I said, if your stipend doesn't match your cost of living, you're going to need to make some arrangements in terms of how you want to, or how you thought you were going to be moving through grad school. Same with clinical/research population of interest. This one might be a little bit different, but at least in terms of your application, if you're applying to like an urban city or like an urban city setting or something like that, and that has a population you want to work with, that's just another reason that you can say, this is why this is just another reason why this university is the perfect fit for me, right? Because like it has my clinical and research population here and it's so prevalent, and now I can like learn all these things. Like Wendy, for example, like TCK, like if you're applying to work at a school with like a lot of international students, you could say like, that's a great research participant pool for me. So just thinking about things like that. And then university/school. So what kind of school do you want to go to? This is a little bit, I wasn't necessarily thinking this far when I thought about, you know, what type of school do I want to do? But now that I look back on it, it's probably something I should have looked a little bit more at. So do you want to be like Georgia State? I think technically is an R1. So I think we've had like the R1 conversation before, but like R1, R2, R3, R4 are research designations for different universities and like college systems in general. So do you want to go to R1? If you want to go to an R1, that's going to be, that's probably going to affect the amount of research that you're also doing and also the amount of research that your faculty member may be doing. So it's probably going to affect your faculty member more than you, honestly, because either way, we're going to be doing research if we're doing PhD programs. But just keep that in mind. That can like sometimes contribute to the culture of like the school/the program. So just something to consider. And also how many, I mean, if the school's program is like a R1, like what their reputation in the research world is in terms of funding, in terms of like what people think of when they think of, you know, eventually what will be your alma mater. So application materials. Some of y'all asked like what will make certain things stick out. So I just kind of did like a stronger, weaker list. So stronger, again, this is for, I only applied to counseling and clinical psych programs. For community psych, for like counselor ed, it may be different. Like I said, I know counselor ed at Georgia State, it's not like as advisor centered. You more apply to the program in general and like maybe generally the faculty, but not one specific person. For stronger, I said for programs where you are applying for like one specific person, it's good to mention that person, especially how you feel like there, whatever overlap there is. So this mention would come only if they're asking for a personal statement. If they also ask for a research statement, then I would probably put that information in a research statement. Okay, does that make sense? I don't know how many of y'all have both of those things, and sometimes it's wrapped up all into one. Sometimes they call it like a statement of purpose or something. So make sure you're reading the guidelines that they want you to talk about before you obviously start writing. Also, like creating a personal connection. So you don't want your personal statement to just be like rattling off like, I don't know, all the like jobs you have. You don't want it to be like a recap of your CV. And that goes the same for your research too. It should not be a recap of your CV. It should be some new information because they already have your CV, but some new information on like what makes you you. It should be unique, you know, it shouldn't hopefully sound like every other personal statement. And that's kind of hard to define. But when I think of like personal statements, like for me, I think of like, my passion as like a blah, 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 blah. And like it started all when I was like an infant or I don't know. So there are certain ways that you can kind of like tailor that because you are going to be telling your story, but you can tailor that into a way that sounds like a little bit fresher and hopefully not as repetitive as some of the applications they may be reading already. And then also just balance your professional, like a review of your professional self and a review of your personal self. So you don't want to have too much of one or the other. So it really should be like a balance. And you can ask folks when you're getting feedback from them, what their thoughts are, if it's like needs to be warmer, if it's like too inviting and you're oversharing. That's really good feedback to try to get from folks in your life who are going to tell you the truth. So for research statement, I said discuss research overlap. One piece of advice I've gotten over the years, especially writing fellowships in general, anything research related, is like try to like show, not tell your skills. So it's one thing to say like I organized, I led, and I published, but it's another thing to say like, or like to say I have leadership skills, but you can kind of create like a narrative of during my work in leading this so-and-so group, I was able to identify this and this and this. And through that, I learned like this about myself, you know? So like incorporate like that nice balance of like, here's my research and also like, here's the way it affects me. And like, we're just gonna keep building on the story. Don't like have super vague details listed, like analyzed data, at least in your research statement. Like it'd be helpful, like maybe to explain a little more. So like if you have something, always if you have something that is a little bit like more advanced or a little bit maybe like unique to you, you might want to mention it, right? So if you analyze data, but the data that you analyzed were like, I don't know, like a latent profile analysis and you have to learn like the statistical whatever, not saying that like y'all need to do that, but if it's something like that, then like mention it, because sometimes specifics can be helpful, especially when folks are trying to think about like, where would you fall in this program? Like where, like what could you be helpful for and what could you be useful for and what do you bring? So for CV, somebody asked what to put on your CV. Research experience, obviously clinical experience, any type of service. So keep in mind that all of these things should be related to what you're doing. So it doesn't have to be so related that it's like, oh no, like I was doing work on like domestic abuse and now I'm like actually in, I'm actually interested in, I don't know, like folks living with HIV or something like that. Like that's still research experience that you can still somehow like include, but don't include like I dog walked for 6 years, because that might not be super relevant to what, so just try to think about, you know, what's relevant and what shows off the skills that you can bring to the program. So teaching experience, if you have that, that's great to add. Any type of leadership. So that kind of goes in line with service a little bit, but like, even if you're in like, for example, I know some of y'all are in like, what's that thing for counselor ed? I know Hannah's in it.
CSI.
CSI, yes. So some of y'all are in CSI, make sure that's on there. I'm sure it is. Publications. So your publications like in progress, submitted, accepted. So presentations, I don't really know if you could say presentations in progress. I was trying to leave space for like things that might be happening with Corona related stuff, but like presentations. So you could say if they've been submitted or accepted. Workshops, training, certification. So anything that you got, like I said, I think I said this last semester, anything you've gotten, some type of like certificate saying that you did, some type of thing that says, oh, now I'm like competent in this, or I have like, it's official. Definitely put that on your CV. Anything else? Fellowships. You always want to include fellowships. I know we talked about that earlier, but like any type of money you're getting from anybody, put that on there. Any type of scholarships you've gotten in the past, put that on there. Grants, put that on there. So that's just something to include. Okay, so recommendations should, a few things. They definitely should be strong. I usually, if there's like any type of question about it, there are certain ways that you can ask the person, like, could you write me a strong recommendation? Ellie, I know you had a question about like, kind of like clout versus closeness in terms of like, this person has like a huge name and like, it would look so great if I got a recommendation letter for them versus this person like maybe isn't like in that same arena, but they know me really well and they know my work and they can speak to that. So it's a balance. I won't say you should go one or the other, because like a person that you don't know as well could still write like a pretty strong recommendation, but you just want to make sure that they can do that and make sure they have the resources to do that. So like I've said before, you want to make sure your recommendations are able to speak into different aspects of your work. So somebody like at your clinical site, maybe do a recommendation there. Somebody who's seen your research in your lab, recommendation there. Somebody who's taught you or like maybe supervised you in some way, like with your assistantship or something like that, recommendation there. Okay, so different areas of your life where you can show like, you have diversity in your skill base, and also a lot of different people can speak to that and strongly speak to that too. So I always give at least a month, or at least I try to give at least a month for folks to give me a recommendation letter. People are busy, so just like keep that in mind. And also when you reach out to them and request it, just like include the guidelines, always include the guidelines for what they're supposed to be recommending you on, what the recommendation is supposed to look like, how long it's supposed to be, what they're supposed to include, and where they're supposed to submit, and when. It's usually helpful to give them like a copy of your CV, just so they know like your most up-to-date an up-to-date copy, just so they know what you've been up to. Also, I like to give potential points of discussion. So like I said, you want to try to create like a story. So if you're getting if you're specifically reaching out to somebody for their clinical or for like your supervision clinically, so they can speak to your clinical skills, then you might want to say like, can you speak to like me working across like trauma across different developmental stages? Can you say a lot about that? And can you say a lot about how I use narrative therapy to do that, and how I work with marginalized groups? I'm doing an example for myself, obviously, but so something like that might be really helpful for them to craft like exactly what you say, because just another thing, you might not / you usually don't get to see your letter ahead of time, depending on who it is. So like I've had people who have sent me my letters before and been like, does it look okay? Is everything okay? But also some people will just, depending on how the application process is, they will just send it. So you don't really know what they're sending. So at least you can kind of give people like a guideline. Some people are a little bit iffy about sharing what they say in their recommendation letter though. So just know that. And possible application draft, I just put that in there. Sometimes people are like just generally interested. Sometimes people don't care. Sometimes people really need it to be able to know, who they're representing also. So lots of different ways that could shake out, but those are just some possibilities. So for writing sample, sometimes writing samples are required, sometimes they aren't. Even when there was like an option, I think I might have put like a poster in there. I don't really even know if you're supposed to do that, but I think it might have been, okay, I'm not going to pretend to remember because now I can't remember. But somebody asked about writing samples, and I don't really have that much feedback for that or advice for that, other than make sure you take that thing through like multiple edits, as you should with all of your written pieces in this, including your CV, because CV things are like kind of glaring if something's out of place. So just make sure you go through multiple edits, get feedback from multiple people, and try to have at least like something I've read somewhere one time and I feel like makes sense, is like if there can be some type of overlap in between what you're writing about in the writing sample and what you're interested in. So if you're writing about like biophysics and you're applying for like a clinical psych program, unless the research interests are like within biophysics as well, and it's like some type of interdisciplinary thing, you might want to not do that, so just try to make it as close as possible. Again, like tailor your application to what you're applying for. So application weak spots. So I think that, and what I've seen is like for GRA and GPA, if they're, and I'm also speaking from personal experience, if those things are like a little bit lower, again, just like a brief message on like what that was about, if it's like at the point where you feel like it needs to be mentioned. Like, for example, my GRE scores were standard. So I spoke to that and I said, like, for math, it was like math wasn't like a field where I think I said like I was challenged or something, but like grew as a something. So, try to make it like a little bit of like a come up story if you can, because hopefully those like weak spots, as like someone has called it, like hopefully those weak spots can turn into like tough spots, and you want to kind of try to show the way that's happened. Somebody also asked about lack of publications, and I think a lack of publications. So I wouldn't necessarily like, that's not necessarily a weak spot. I mean, it could be seen as a weak spot, but it's not necessarily something that I would call more attention to. It really depends on what you think you should do. So if your person you're applying to is like busting out publications left and right, and like maybe you even talked to like a student and like they said that research experience or like lack of, or publications are like required for this, then you might want to speak to that. But if that's not like what the norm is, you don't want to call more attention to something that isn't the norm, you know? Same with lack of experience, unless it's something that like is helping to create your narrative, then you don't want to touch on like the points that you feel like may make your application slightly less competitive, okay? Funding, okay, so there are three different types of funding, as I said. So there's like the programmatic funding, well, usually three different types of funding. There's college funding, so that Dean's Fellowship is like within the college, right? So a little bit more competitive. So it goes from like less competitive to most competitive, left to right. So programmatic funding, college funding, which are usually also kind of not major specific, but just like family specific a little bit, like social science, like we're in the College of Education and Human Development. So people within that arena will be getting that funding. And then external funding or like larger funding within college. So there's also GSU general scholarships, and then external funding is like everything else. So like NSF, like Ford fellowships, things like that, that maybe are well known, maybe are not, depending on what you're applying for, but that would be outside of the university, that like may or may not be more or less competitive depending about how many people know about them in general. In terms of looking for funding, which I think was also Wendy's question, there are different ways that you can do that. Like I said, talking to your advisor, talking to students. There are lots of forums online too, in terms of like, depending on what type of funding you want to apply for. For example, like NSF grants, I think that's like your first and second year you can apply for those. I mean, wow, there's a lot of resources out there in terms of like how to sculpt an NSF grant or an NSF grant application, because it's just such a tailored way of writing. It's a way of scientific writing, but it's really tailored in terms of like the style of NSF. So you want to get yourself versed on that. If it's something big like that, which does mean it will be more competitive, so keep that in mind. But if it's something like that and there are resources out there, you definitely want to be looking for them. There are like forums like gradcafe.com or like Reddit, different places for grad students to talk about those types of fellowships too. So you can get like lists from there, and also just regular Google searches, also through APA, lots of options, and join listservs. So if you're like on the division, like for example, I'm on division 44 listserv. So like I'm getting all these emails about like, oh, LGBTQ this, oh, like sexual minority that, like all these things that are relevant to me. So I know if I want to apply for a grant in that, I can just like hop on the listserv and like see what's been sent in the past 2 months, and then try to maybe tailor the research I want to do to fit that and see if I get it. So making sure you use your networks and your resources as like wisely as possible, because there are a lot of things out there, especially once you start to get like hone down even deeper what your interests are. Does that make sense? Okay. So timeline depends. So in this, I have like in the notes when I send this, there are what would you call it? Like different links to different timelines. I said it depends because I know all of your applications are at different times. And also like this really does depend. Like there are different places that are like, okay, some where you write your personal statement, this and this and this, but at the end of the day, only you know how fast you work. So if you started planning in November and some website told you that it was supposed to be done by then, like it could be done by then, but you know how fast you work. So give yourself more time always, is just my general thing. Working over the summer for me is like best on things like that, because at least it's not like a full swing semester. But now that we're in the full swing semester, know yourself. So plan enough time for people to give you feedback too, because your emergency is not their emergency. So you texting them like at the 11th hour doesn't mean that you're going to get those edits back at the 12th hour. So just really trying to work around that and be respectful of your time, of other people's time, and make sure that you're putting your best foot. Because like at the end of the day, you don't want to submit an application that is not what you feel like is representative of yourself. You don't. And you don't want somebody else signing off on you with that application that you're not even proud of, like multiple people, right? So like think about everybody that is involved in this process. Think about all the money, all the time, all the like blood, sweat, and tears, you know, everything that goes into this. And then like think about how long you think it would take, and then like add 2 months, okay? Like add 2 months because life happens. So just try to like be aware of that. Okay. So somebody asked about career options. I just put a few down. So there's lots of different ways that you can take this. A lot of times programs aren't going to expect you to know exactly, or at least like if they're, you know, hopefully they're giving you some space to not know exactly what you want to do when you graduate. But it is something to think about depending on the program that you want to go to, especially, like I said, none of us are thinking PsyDs, I don't think, but like if you're doing PsyD, then that's clinical. You know, if you're doing ED, like those are specific things, but within a PhD, you have a little bit more freedom to do whatever you want. So that process to narrow down may take a little bit of time. So in clinical, you could do like private practice, nonprofit, like you could have a consortium with folks, academia. So do you want to teach PhD students? Do you want to teach master's students? Do you want to teach undergrads? Do you want to be at a four-year college? Do you want to be at a community college? You know, like liberal arts, Ivy League, R1, R2, R3. Those are things to think about. Not like, I would keep them in mind when you're applying for schools, but more when you're going through school. So while you're going through your doc program, those are things to keep in mind, because that doc program is just a setup. Like it's a setup for you to launch your career. So you want to be doing things that are relevant to your career and things that will make you a competitive applicant for whatever you decide to do. If you're not applying and you're like doing clinical or something like that, still, you're going to need to have the hours for licensure. Everything requires a plan. So you want to be thinking about that while you're working through it. You could go into policy, you could work for the government, you could do some type of like public research, some type of ethics, you could work for like a board, supervision, consultation. You could also like be like a business consultant, lots of different things. Research, again, you could work grant to grant, public institutions, private institutions, and then you could do like forensic, legal. That kind of gets into a little bit of like what type of program, what type of degree you want. But again, all of these can have some type of overlap, and they usually do. So don't think that these are separate. They are just some options that I decided to add. Okay, so other general questions. So when having more clinical over research experience, how do you show that you'll be a good asset to a research team? That's a really good question. So your clinical experience can hopefully apply in some way. Like again, yeah, we have to be creative, but it should be able to apply some way to what you're interested in research. Whether it's like you develop leadership skills, you were able to like develop some type of like training or technique in clinical that like then launched your interest into researching this, you know, some like just think about really honestly, you're making a story, but you are the story. So think about really what did happen. Oh yeah, I realized I actually wasn't into this. And so then it propelled me into this. If that's what happened, then you can share that. And you can just share that in a crafted way that shows that you've like built your skills, you've developed, and like matured, and now you're like ready to like introduce yourself into the world of research or like get further acquainted into it. Things that could be done between now and November to strengthen your application, I would just say getting involved in as much as you can. So like, well, one thing I would say is like to strengthen your application in general, like just time for your application, time for writing really could be like because at this point, you don't want to just be like taking your time that you could spend writing, that you could spend editing, or even working on your research into and spreading that way too thin, and then ending up, both of these things, like now I kind of like essentially half-assed my research project, and also my personal statement isn't where I wanted it to be because I stretched myself too thin. So just keep that in mind. But you can get involved in certain things. So I will say, like, if you could get any type of like presentations right now, any type of like other research experience in general, if you could try to even submit, or I don't know how many folks are in this, but like maybe even try to submit to like a presentation, like just to have that submission to say that you submitted it, or just to have a submission. Or you could write something. I'm thinking about Wendy. Wendy wrote like the article. It was not for a journal, but it was like an online article. You could do something like that. Like that's really cool. And that's showing how diverse you are as a like as a person. Like you're talking to these outlets and you're doing these things. So lots of different ways, but I would say don't worry too much about what you can change right now. I would worry about how you can present it, because we do have limited time at this point. So personal preference. For me, that's the way I work. But if you want to try to add things, then that's like also can happen too. Also, sorry, I wanted to keep using as an example, but I remember your check-in really well because it was super early. But like I'm thinking about the crisis hours too. Like that's like a clinical experience that you can get now. That's like I was given advice for that when I was in undergrad. Like do some type of crisis thing because that will give you kind of like a real life look at that stuff. So if y'all don't have clinical experience, that's a way to get it, or a way to get like something like it. What can I do in the last few weeks to make my application stronger? Honestly, just send it to as many people as possible, and make sure you give yourself enough time to go through that feedback and actually apply it. Because people will miss things. You would be surprised how many people can look over something and miss the same thing over and over again. And also, I don't know if anyone, just to put it out there, y'all, anybody that like helps you along this way, make sure you thank them because like I know it can get a lot like wrapped up in all of this, but people will remember when you thank them. And you want to make sure that you have as many resources, as much networking as you can, because those people will help you again if you show your gratitude. So, I mean, like I know Corona is a little bit different now with times, but like I used to do letters of thanks to people. You could send like people, even like an e-letter. Like I did an interview with somebody and they sent me an e-letter. I was like, wow, that really stuck you out from like all the rest. And if you have any other questions, ask me. Like I'm here. So just make sure you're thanking folks with that. You don't have to buy them anything, but I mean, if you want to, go ahead. But I haven't done that. I've just like given letters of thanks and like people have been really responsive to that. Best way to prepare to do a doctoral interview. So if you haven't already, I would take a look at Mitch's grad school advice, which is linked in the Qualtrics, but that has a list of all the questions that you can ask people. And then also what I did, so I used those questions and I like just Googled the questions people usually ask in like PhD. And then I also started to think about questions that people ask, like what would be the follow-up question to that? Or like what would I expect? And this is another question you can ask Carlene too, in terms of what she is looking for in folks that are applying and what she asks of folks. But just give yourself a list of questions. Like I'm not joking. I had like a 3-page list of questions and I sat there and I thought about my answers to every one. And like for some of them, I even wrote them out. For me, that was what was most helpful because it got me prepared to answer questions and also got me prepared to ask the right questions that were meaningful, purposeful, intentional, all that stuff. Okay, how should one best prepare? Yeah, look at the questions, practice with somebody, make sure you feel comfortable in your clothes. I know this is like kind of a different space again because on Zoom, but like you want to make sure you're comfortable. Like make sure everything is set up the way it needs to be before. If you need to turn the fan on, if you need to have water, like do that because you're already going to feel really uncomfortable and your anxiety might be through the roof at that point. So not saying like that necessarily will happen, but just be kind to yourself during that process because interview day can feel really, really long. Any similarities in the master's application process? I would just say, that there are similarities. I think that this is just like, I mean, it's another application. It doesn't have to be super daunting or scary. Like it can be, and that's okay, but it doesn't have to be because y'all already know that you're qualified. Y'all were qualified, you got into this program. So, I mean, like the similarities are maybe like within some of the application materials, but also like you've grown. So there are going to be a lot of things that are different hopefully like in your application now than your master's application. So like it will just naturally be a different process as a whole because you are now like you're in a different part in life. We kind of talked about how folks stand out in like the different aspects. And then if I had anything I would change or redo, that's a really good question, Hannah. And I remember reading that and I was like, oh yeah, that's a great question. If there's anything I would change or redo, I think that Mm, and I should have thought about this when I was thinking about what a good question it was. I feel like I would say probably I would give myself, I don't know, I gave myself a lot of time. I think I might um, be a little more, I feel like at first I started off wanting to stay really, really close to home. And then I realized that that wasn't so obviously because I'm like 10 hours away from home now, but then I realized that that wasn't so important for me. So really like, you know, it's a balance, right? Like you want to honor your values and you also want to be open to the possibilities. So like for me, I feel like having more of that balance would have been helpful in the beginning, at least. Like eventually I got there, but in the beginning, in terms of like trying to track everything out and think about like what I was open to, like what I want to be in the Midwest, what I want to be somewhere where it snows all the time. So like sometimes I was too open and other times I wasn't open enough. And like deep down, you know, like I'm not going to be in Michigan. It's too cold. But like I knew that, but I still applied. So like that was like $100 I could have like, so like different ways that like you can honor yourself and also like, you know, give yourself like opportunities because you don't want to be too narrow.